Hello, I'm here again reading from The Eye of the Eye, From Which Nothing is Hidden by Dr. David R. Hawkins. We are in section 3, The Path of Consciousness, and we're now on chapter 9, which is called Advanced Awareness. I'm really enjoying reading his books and reading this one again, so I hope you're enjoying it too. So let's begin. Get yourself comfortable. And here we go. Advanced Awareness. Nature of the pathway. The direct avenue to advanced awareness via consciousness bypasses form, duality, and perception. Conflict and error arise from form, which is also the home of force. Power resides within the domain of the formless. Formlessness might be said to emerge noticeably at the consciousness level that calibrates at 500 and progresses to 600, at which level form disappears into formlessness. Eventually, it is recognized that form is constituted by the formless, and that they are one and the same. But until that realization occurs, form itself is a distraction and a delay that is best avoided. Avoid the distraction of form. Many spiritual teachings that are expressed in form frequently lead to what is best termed as astral realms of consciousness, which in themselves can be seductive, unending, and pleasurable, but they do not lead to enlightenment. Form reinforces the illusion that there is a seeker on some sort of pathway with rungs and signposts and even spirit guides positioned along the way. On the spiritual climb to the peak of enlightenment, there are actually no entities to meet you along the way. Astral planes, like teachings, can be calibrated. There are low planes, hells, intermediate planes, purgatory or limbo, and the higher astral planes, celestial. These are all possible destinations of the soul or spiritual body or focus of consciousness. Each of these levels has its own hierarchies, gods, and folklore that are real to the inhabitants of these planes. These may be gratifying, even joyful and thrilling, but they are not enlightenment. That which is reality is beyond all form, and yet intrinsic to it. Let form reveal its own nature. There is no need to seek it. Also, one needs to be wary to not be caught in the supposed opposites or alternatives of form versus formlessness, or allness versus void, or fullness versus emptiness. These are merely descriptive linguistics with no intrinsic reality. One does not have to choose between the real and the unreal, since the unreal does not exist. The direction of the exploration. The search is progressively within to discover the source of the knowingness of the sense of I. People say, I know myself, but what does that mean? In ordinary parlance, it means to be aware of the nature of the ego, and therefore implies awareness of one's own psychology, the ego and its forms. The awareness of the self is in actuality that replaces the ego as the seat of the sense of me or I. In the process of spiritual discovery, one looks instead to discover what it is that is aware of and has the authority to sense the existence of I-ness or the quality of I-ness, rather than a specific or circumscribed me as the I. Note that both God and all references to the divine are capitalized, and that of all the possible pronouns, only I is capitalized. The individual I can only be aware of itself or its existence as a consequence of the greater awareness. This is the innate quality of the divine I, that is its source and the focus of the spiritual search. As such, it is thus non-verbal and the source of experiencing, witnessing and observing. By analogy, one comes to realize that one is the water and not the fish. The basic process. To look within is an attitude rather than a technique or spiritual practice. This means to relinquish the fascination with the content of the mind and the world that it reflects. This detachment may be felt initially as a possible loss, as if one is experiencing the death of the world and all its promises. Such a death may be passively experienced as such, but it is merely the passing of an illusion. The source of pleasure never was without, but was always within. It was never the world that granted pleasure at all, but one's own enjoyment of it. It is not really the loss of the world itself that is feared, but boredom. Boredom passes when it is recognized as merely the consequence of clinging to a yearning for the past or the future, and it is only the ego that can be born. The ego thrives on novelty and is completely dependent on what is happening next. The ego therefore thrives and lives on anticipation of future satisfaction, instead of experiencing the absolute completion that is available only in the now. Akin to the fear of boredom is its underlying illusion that boredom is constituted by nothingness. The illusion of a possible void presents itself and seems a threat. The path, then, is from letting go of the illusion of the realm of the everythingness of the mind world, through the illusion of void nothingness, to the goal of the awareness of allness that replaces both prior illusory states. It is reassuring to remember that all states are illusions and capable of being traversed by the spiritual will and progressive awareness. Who is doing the seeking? The illusion of the ego dissolves as the prefix I is removed from all action. What ego claims as its actions are merely self-existent characteristics, whose functions are automatic, determined by local conditions, and without an imaginary I to activate them. One does not think, feel, or even exist because of an action or decision by some inner invisible I. Thinking and feeling occur unasked. What is searching for higher truth is not a personal I, but an aspect of consciousness itself that expresses as inspiration, devotion, dedication, and perseverance, all of which are aspects of the spiritual will. Therefore, the source of the search for the self is the self itself, actualizing the necessary processes by virtue of its own qualities, which are facilitated by grace. As another example, curiosity is a quality that exists without a personal self or decision to activate it. Curiosity, one might say, is an independent, impersonal quality of consciousness and is universal throughout the animal kingdom. It does not need an I to be curious. There is no inner, independent, personal I that makes decisions. To prefix all thinking, action, and feeling with the pronoun I is just a convenience of speech. The inner personal self could be referred to just as well as an it. There are stages during spiritual evolution when both the mind and body do seem, for periods of time, to be its. The body goes about its business as though it had been rehearsed, and the mind speaks to others in conversation without an inner personal self to direct it. There is no inner thinker behind thoughts, no doer behind actions, no seeker of enlightenment. Seeking occurs on its own, when the time for it is right, and it emerges as a focus of attention. All aspects and qualities of consciousness are self-actuating and energize each other under the general direction of the will. The will as a tool. The capricious and carnival-like nature of the mind's activities precludes it as a fruitful focus for spiritual evolution. One can order the mind to do one thing or another, but it will refuse. To try to control the mind is like a cat chasing its tail. To try to control the mind already results in the duality of the controller and the controlled, as well as the contents of what is to be controlled and the how of controlling. The only space from which to address mind is from that quality called will. One can locate this area without too much difficulty, whereas thoughts, feelings, and images pass through the mind continuously. The will is relatively motionless and fixed. It tends to persist in a more stable and therefore approachable manner. The will can indeed be quite fixed, committed, one-pointed, and immovable, unlike the mind that flits about like a nervous butterfly. Therefore, the most profitable point of view from which to approach the mind is afforded by focusing the sense of self as emanating from the will. The will is malleable, but only slowly and deliberately, so by reflection. It is a workable place from which to proceed and explore. The will is closer to the true self than is ordinary mind with its thoughts, beliefs, concepts, ideas, and fluctuating emotions. Contemplation. This is the most fruitful and meaningful activity of spiritual work. With very little practice, one can acquire the capacity to function in the world with only minor interruption of reflection and contemplation. Meditation, as it is usually practiced, however, is limited in time and place, and often involves seclusion and cessation of activity. Although contemplation and reflection seem less intense, actually, by their constant influence, they wear away the obstacles. Contemplation is therefore a mode of meditation that is not less than or inferior to sit-down, cross-legged meditation. Empowerment of the spiritual will. The will is activated and empowered by devotion, and it responds with inspiration, which leads to illumination by grace. The personal will dissolves into divine will, and the spark that leads to the spiritual search and inquiry is a divine gift. The readiness to initiate the journey cannot be forced, nor can people be faulted if it has not occurred in them as yet. The level of consciousness has to have advanced to the stage where such an intention would be meaningful and attractive. Once inspired, a seeker will often forego all customary conveniences and lifestyles and sacrifice anything that stands in the way. The illusions of the ego are tenacious, but relatively fragile when subordinated to the spiritual will. The ego mind is fortified by habit that crumbles when its underpinnings are removed. The ego is not an enemy to be subdued, but merely a compilation of unexamined habits of perception. The self that activates the spiritual will is the home of infinite power against which the ego's house of cards cannot stand. The self is like an infinitely powerful magnet that has the capacity to dissolve the structure of the ego if and when the spiritual will gives assent. There is no one to take credit for the progression of spiritual awareness, nor is there anyone to blame if it does not seem to occur. With spiritual work, the terms is or are become progressively replaced by the term seems to, which is due to the increasing realization of the degree to which perception is the mask that hinders truth. Until the absolute reality reveals itself, it is closer to reality to hold all seeming knowledge as merely hypothetical. Even now in society, this understanding is surfacing as evidenced by the frequent use of the term perceived, e.g., the person reacted to a perceived threat. The emergence of this discernment is a very important and significant development. It is the first real indication of an emerging awareness of the limitations of the ego and the fallibility of perception. This increase in social awareness of the limitation of the ego is reinforced by the recent discoveries of false judicial verdicts as revealed by DNA testing, and by the research which shows that witnesses are actually very unreliable and prone to serious error to a great degree. Psychologists have also discovered retrograde falsifications of memory, with displacements of events in time and place. Society thus struggles to differentiate truth from falsehood, but thus far is not aware of how it can actually be accomplished dependably. The spiritual will is enforced and activated by love and devotion and its willingness to surrender. Love is without form and is that capacity through which one becomes willing, out of that love, to surrender one's positionalities to God. The classical way of the great religious saints was the adoration, love, and worship of God, either unmanifest or manifest as the great divine teachers. Profound dedication and devotion can overcome all resistance, and thus the way of the heart and the way of the mind, or consciousness, eventually merge. Meditation. It is rewarding to initiate the meditative process from the viewpoint that the I, or me, is located within the spiritual will. Because the will is relatively steady and unchanging, it becomes the seat from which to progress through consciousness to the transcendent awareness of the self, which is the expression of God as the absolute the I of reality. It is actually the spiritual will that determines destiny or karma. The will is the seat of power of the self as it extends to mind and, as such, is the region of direct contact with the Holy Spirit. At the level of will, form and formlessness meet. Here, the formless qualities of love, devotion, gratitude, humility, inspiration, and faith meet the particulars of the mind, with its forms of ideas, thoughts, memories, conflicts, and images. In the spiritual will, the goals that are valued or desired are now exposed to the formless spiritual qualities of love, forgiveness, and devotion. Through humility and the choice of peace out of love, one can relinquish even the most cherished of negativities, such as revenge, spite, or hatred. The small self is dissolved by the self. The healing attitude of the self to the self is compassion. It is through forgiveness that one is forgiven. This willingness to surrender, arising out of the grace of God, permits the power of God expressed as the Holy Spirit to recontextualize understanding and, by this device, to undo the reign of perception and its attendant duality that is the source of all suffering. The dissolution of duality is the ultimate gift of God, for it dissolves the very source and capacity for suffering. In non-duality, suffering is not possible. Dogma. The way to God via the non-duality of consciousness involves no dogma or belief systems. Sufficient useful information is available, the truth of which can be verified by one's own inner quest that is crucial to progress, especially if one is dedicated to enlightenment in this lifetime. The value of any piece of information can be easily calibrated. It will also be discovered that each time this exercise is done, something more is learned that was not part of the original question verbatim. Diets, rituals, exercises, breathing techniques, mantras, and symbols. Although none of these is actually necessary, they can be helpful to some spiritual devotees. It is useful to recognize that religions have their own agendas and limitations. The spiritual pathway to enlightenment is unique. It is not the same as practicing a religion. Religion tends to emphasize historical events, their geographical locations and past cultures with political alliances. Enlightenment happens in the present moment and is outside time, history, or geography, which are therefore irrelevant. Theology is concerned with the consciousness level of the 400s. Enlightenment is concerned with the levels of 600 and above. What of music, incense, and architectural beauty? These are inspirational and supportive of a spiritual and reverential mood and attitude, and help to remove the focus of attention from thought content. Beauty is uplifting and calibrates in the high 500s, which is akin to perfection. What is the essence of spiritual practice? To activate by inspiration, dedication, and decision of will those aspects of consciousness that become progressively self-actualizing. They are empowered by compassion, devotion, humility, and the willingness to surrender to unconditional love. Perception then transforms into spiritual vision. This evolution evokes a supportive response from the highest levels of consciousness, for it takes great power to overcome the gravity of the earthly life and its habits of perception. The act of worship is an entreaty and invitation to these higher energies for assistance in one's spiritual endeavour. What of daily life? There is a shift of values from worldly accomplishment to spiritual realization, which colours all activity. It places it in a different context. The overreaching goal of life becomes altered, and life events take on a different significance and meaning, as though placed in a new dimension. Eventually, the focus is on the inner, silent, motionless, still presence of awareness itself, rather than on its passing content. Suddenly, the sense of I shifts from the content to the context, which is the universal I of the self. Why is work even necessary in spiritual endeavour? The ego can be thought of as a set of entrenched habits of thought that are the result of entrainment by invisible energy fields which dominate human consciousness. They become reinforced by repetition and by the consensus of society. Further reinforcement comes from language itself. To think in language is a form of self-programming. The use of the prefix I as the subject, and therefore the implied cause of all actions, is the most serious error and automatically creates a duality of subject and object. To overcome the gravity of worldly thoughts and beliefs requires the work of implementing the decision of the spiritual will to deprogram consciousness. This includes the refusal to accept the ego mind's presumptions and statements as though they were reality. Instead, there is an insistence on a higher understanding. Familiarity with the more compassionate viewpoints of life tends to potentiate them. Thus, the traditional spiritual advice to mingle with holy company and avoid negative companions. This potentiates progressive discernment of more appropriate attitudes and habits of thought. Of what use is prayer? Supplication is an act of humility. To lower levels of consciousness, prayer is an attempt to get something for self or others, such as a new car, a job, recovery from an illness, or special favours. With progress, this intention to control God is given up, and the act of supplication becomes a dedication instead of a request. In war, both sides pray to win. With progression of consciousness from selfishness to selflessness, the quality of prayer shifts to the willingness to be a servant of the Lord and a channel of His will without trying to specify the what or the how it is to be done. Prayer becomes surrender rather than supplication. Many children lose their faith in God by using prayer in the form of pleading, and then become disappointed when the requested benefit fails to appear. What is the healing power of prayer? All love arises from God. On the scale of consciousness, love calibrates at 500, and as it is perfected, it reaches unconditional love at 540, which is the level of healing. Healing prayer services thus seek to replace negativity with an energy field of 540 or over. Some spiritual organizations calibrate at 540 or above, and therefore provide a field of healing energy that is capable of accomplishing miracles. What is a miracle? If an event occurs outside the domain of explanation or expected linear causality and the Newtonian paradigm, it is termed a miracle. It is an eventuality that is brought into actuality by removal of the impediments of negativity. This may involve relinquishment of limiting belief systems such as it is impossible or it is not deserved or other ego viewpoints. For those who have reached higher levels of consciousness, the miraculous is not only commonplace, it is the natural course of events and becomes continuous. The miraculous comes out of creation and not causality. Spiritual principles. Attitude. The way of spiritual advancement through consciousness is actually uncomplicated and simple. The primary quality is really one of attitude, in that one looks at life not as a place to acquire gain, but as an opportunity for learning, which abounds even in the smallest of life's details. A spiritual attitude leads one to be friendly, kind, and well-meaning to all life. We find ourselves walking over an ant carefully rather than squishing it, not as a compulsive must or a religious rule, but out of a greater awareness of the value of all life. All animals will be discovered to actually be individuals that respond to respect and attention. Even plants are aware of it when you love and admire them. Humility. This again is an attitude and awareness of the limitations of the mind and appearance. There is an increasing awareness that life is filtered through perception, and that what is going on is primarily attitudes and perceptions rather than self-existent external realities. Willingness to overlook and forgive. Kindness. As a serious spiritual student, one has to resign from the self-appointed duties of being the one to judge, correct, control, direct, change the world, and express opinions about everything. As a serious spiritual student, one is no longer obligated to continue these chores, and instead, they are turned over to divine justice, inasmuch as the mind has no idea of what reality even is. Relinquishing these former duties will be a relief and also bring an end to a lot of guilt. It is therefore quite helpful to give up causes and rallies for the oppressed, downtrodden, other victims and sentimentalities. Each person is merely fulfilling their own destiny. Allow them to do so. With detachment, it will be observed that most people derive satisfaction from the melodrama of their lives. Observation of people. Physical appearance is a great deceiver. Most people look like adults, but are not really adults at all. Emotionally, most people are still children. The emotions and attitudes that prevail in kindergarten and on the playground continue on into adult life, but are hidden in more dignified sounding terminology. Within most people, it is a child who is merely imitating being an adult. The inner child we hear so much about is actually not inner at all. It is actually quite outer. As people grow up, they take on various identifications and copy what they conceive of as adult behaviours and styles. However, it is not the adult who is doing this, but the child. Therefore, what we see in daily life are people acting out the programs and scenarios that they identify with as a child. The young child, as well as most animals, already exhibits curiosity, self-pity, jealousy, envy, competitiveness, temper tantrums, emotional outbursts, resentments, hatreds, rivalries, competition, seeking the limelight and admiration, willfulness, petulance, blaming others, disclaiming responsibility, making others wrong, looking for favour, collecting things, showing off and more. These are all attributes of the child. As we watch the daily activities of most adults, we realise that nothing has really changed. This realisation is helpful for compassionate understanding rather than condemnation. Stubbornness and opposition, which are characteristic of the 2-year-old, continue to dominate personalities well into old age. Occasionally, people also manage to go from childhood to adolescence in their personality and become endless thrill seekers and challengers of fate. They are preoccupied with the body, muscles, flirtation, popularity, and romantic and sexual conquests. There is a tendency to become cute, coy, seductive, glamorous, heroic, tragic, theatrical, dramatic, and histrionic. Again, this is the child's impression of adolescence being acted out. The inner child is naive and impressionable, easily programmed and easily seduced and manipulated. Curiosity about the nature of consciousness. It is easier to stop reacting to people internally as well as externally by becoming familiar with the nature of consciousness. Human life is very difficult, even in the best of circumstances. Frustrations, delays, lapses of memory, impulses, and stresses of all shapes and forms beset any individual. Demands often exceed capabilities, and life is pressured by time requirements. It will be noticed that everyone's ego is about the same as that of everyone else. The mind is inherited and has a brain run by genes, chromosomes, and a genetically determined personality set. Research shows that many of the personality's major characteristics are already present at birth. Few people can actually be different from what they are. It is only the minority of people that seek self-improvement or spiritual growth. This is because whatever one's self-criticisms, one secretly really believes that one's way of being is okay, and probably the only correct way. They are all right as they are, and all problems are caused by other people's selfishness, unfairness, and by the external world. Seek to give love rather than to receive it. Most humans believe that love is something that you get, that it is an emotion, that it has to be deserved, and that the more they give away, the less they will have. The opposite is the truth. Lovingness is an attitude that transforms one's experience of the world. We become grateful for what we have instead of prideful. We express our lovingness when we acknowledge others and their contributions to life and to our convenience. Love is not an emotion, but a way of being and relating to the world. Avoid creating enemies. People fall into the trap of getting even or making constant remarks. They create enemies and animosities. These preclude a peaceful life. Nobody needs enemies. They can retaliate in ways unseen and so bring on unfortunate consequences. There is no such thing as winning a conflict that results in hatred by the loser. The majority of domestic violence is a physical response to verbal provocation. However, in our society, victims seldom take responsibility for the provocation, temptation, or hurled insult. It serves spiritual progress to always accept responsibility for all that befalls one and avoid the trap of being a victim. From a higher view, there are no victims. Nothing in the world of appearances has the power to cause anything. Choose a benign role and view of life. Harsh viewpoints are not conducive to spiritual growth, even if they are right or justified. A spiritual seeker cannot afford them. One has to give up the luxury of revenge or enjoying that justice has to be done when a supposed murderer is executed. One cannot violate basic spiritual principles without paying a price. The spiritual seeker sees through the illusion and therefore gives up the role of judge and jury. Nobody goes scot-free as people indignantly protest. With muscle testing, one can quickly affirm that not one iota is missed by the universe. Literally, every hair is counted, every fallen sparrow noted. No kind word goes unnoticed. All is recorded forever in the field of consciousness. Give up guilt. Guilt is an attempt to purchase salvation, manipulate God, and purchase forgiveness by suffering. These attitudes stem from the misinterpretation of God as a great punisher. We think we will assuage his righteousness wrath by our pain, suffering, and penance. We think we will assuage his righteous wrath by our pain, suffering, and penance. There is actually only one appropriate penance for wrongdoing, and that is change. Instead of condemning the negative, we choose the positive. To make progress and to change takes more effort than feeling guilty, but it is a more appropriate response. We note from the scale of consciousness that guilt is way down at the bottom, whereas God is way up at the top. Consequently, wallowing around in guilt at the bottom of the field of consciousness does not get us to the top. Humility means that we see our own life as the evolution of spiritual consciousness. We learn from mistakes. Maybe the most useful of all quotes to revise whatever the past behaviour is. It seemed like a good idea at the time. Later, of course, in retrospect, it becomes recontextualized and seems to be an error. However, if other people are intrinsically innocent because that is the nature of consciousness, then so is the self of the spiritual seeker. Along with giving up guilt, it is also very helpful to give up sin as a reality. Error is correctable. Sin is a mistake and is forgivable. Most of what people call sin is an attachment, an emotionality stemming from the child within. It is actually the child who lies, steals, cheats, calls other people names, and hits other people. Therefore, sin is really immaturity and ignorance of the true nature of reality and the nature of consciousness. As spiritual values replace worldly ones, temptation diminishes and error is less likely to occur. Willingness. This is the keystone to all spiritual progress, as well as success in the world. It means letting go of resistance and finding the joy of going 101%. Unpleasantness is due to resistance, and when resistance is let go, it is replaced by feelings of strength, confidence, and joy. In any endeavour, there is a point of resistance that becomes a block. When this is overcome, the endeavour becomes effortless. Athletes often go through this discovery, and so do physical labourers. There is suddenly the release of enormous energy, an emergence into an almost enlightened state in which all is happening of its own. There are a peace, a serenity, and a stillness. The exhausted ballerina or labourer is closer to the discovery of God than they think. The awareness of the presence of God is preceded by surrender. In Zen, it is said that heaven and hell are only a tenth of an inch apart. It is often in the pit of despair that the ego lets go so that all crisis can be turned into the opportunity of spiritual discovery. Realize that truth is dependent on context. Truth is only relative and not absolute. All truth is only so within a certain level of consciousness. For instance, to forgive is commendable, but at a later stage one sees that there is actually nothing to forgive. There is no other to be forgiven. Everyone's ego is equally unreal, including one's own. Perception is not reality. Non-attachment. This is an attitude of withdrawal of emotional entanglement in worldly affairs. It leads to serenity and peace of mind. It is supported by refusing the emotional seduction of other people's upsets and problems. It also involves a willingness to allow the world and its affairs to work out its own problems and destiny. Reactive involvement and intervention in the world can be better left to people who have a different calling. A good person is one thing, enlightenment is another. One is responsible for the effort and not the result, which is up to God and the universe. Non-attachment is not the same as indifference, withdrawal, or detachment. Misunderstanding that the development of detachment is required often ends up as flatness or apathy. In contrast, non-attachment allows full participation in life without trying to control outcomes. Acceptance. Acceptance is the great healer of strife, conflict, and upset. It also corrects major imbalances of perception and precludes the dominance of negative feelings. Everything serves a purpose. Humility means that we will not understand all events or occurrences. Acceptance is not passivity, but non-positionality. The development of a spiritual ego can be avoided by the realization that spiritual progress is the result of God's grace and not the result of one's personal endeavour. Avoid false gurus. This cannot be overemphasized. The naive spiritual initiate is easily swayed by trappings and reputations of spiritual figures and the charisma of those who have many followers. Without the spiritual awareness of advanced states of consciousness, the spiritual seeker has no means of guidance, and popularity clouds judgment. At this time in human history, there is actually not a single guidepost that can be relied upon other than the muscle test of the actual calibration of the level of consciousness of a teacher, organization, or teaching. The naive are impressed with claims of supernatural powers, paranormal feats, and fanciful titles and dress. Earmarks of true teachers are humility, simplicity, lovingness, compassion, and peacefulness. There is no financial charge for conveying truth, as there is no interest in money, personal power, or gain. It is irrelevant to a true teacher whether others become followers or join a spiritual group or organization. All are totally free to leave the spiritual group. There is the avoidance of the development of a personality cult. There is no desire by a true teacher to control others. and therefore a true teacher has no interest in coercion or persuasion. Neither does the teacher attempt to appropriate knowledge or force it on others, inasmuch as it was freely received. Therefore, the true teacher is gracious in manner and spirit. The student of a true teacher is the totality of all mankind. Avoid false teachings. It is often recommended that one use muscle testing to sort out the content of one's spiritual library. Put the books that allow one to go weak on one side and the ones that make one go strong on the other. It is highly educative. It is very important to remember that it is an impersonal fact that the consciousness of the seeker is naive and has no means of discovering truth from falsehood. Avoid the attractive but irrelevant. There are astral realms and universes without number, each with its own teachers, masters, spiritual hierarchy and belief systems. Many are quite intriguing. The unwary can be easily entrapped by these fascinating and esoteric doctrines. However, the seeker of enlightenment will remember that the ultimate state is not reachable via the levels of form. Many people think they ought to be involved in spiritual endeavour, but are intimidated by what appears to be complexity, rituals, requirements, sacrifices, commitments, complicated readings, dogma, and money. Some spiritual groups even insist that the applicant become initiated and go through strange ceremonies, pledges, and agreements. Proprietary groups have mandatory attendance, training, courses, and the payment of many fees. In reality, there is nothing one has to join, do, or study. There are no rules, regulations, or requirements. There are no rituals or strange garb, and no odd breathing exercises or postures are necessary. Many New Age groups sound less demanding but rely on misleading sources of information. There is emphasis on strange garb, odd diets, weird headdresses, and all manner of necklaces, symbols, card readings, psychics, channelings, mediums, chantings, and mantras. It is best to beware of and avoid all manipulation of energies, light fields, mystical visualizations, colours, mystical numbers, signs, and ancient secret teachings. Some misleading figures claim special private instructions from God and become self-proclaimed prophets and visionaries. It is simple to see through all of this with a simple muscle test. These distractions all rely on form and specialness. The whole field takes on a carnival-like atmosphere with reference to spaceships, UFOs, extraterrestrials, and doomsday prophecies. All these aspects are mistakenly labelled as spiritual and tend to be accepted at face value. One is easily misled into the astral circus thinking that it is spiritual. The whole New Age community becomes enamoured of an endless array of babas, masters, and legendary figures, most of whom cause one to go weak with muscle testing. Research reveals that many famous gurus have sold out spiritual integrity for power over others and delusions of grandeur. And there we are. That's that chapter finished. I hope you enjoyed it. I had to stop a few times because I've got a tickly throat today, but I hope that didn't affect the smoothness of the recording. Anyway, I hope you really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed reading it, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Lots of love, and bye for now.